Well, hello, Scouts. My name is Jonathan Glassman. I'm District Director for the Connecticut Yankee Council's Quinnipiac District. Thanks very much for joining us for our Everyday Heroes Camporee. And today we have with us Lieutenant Omar Torre of the United States Coast Guard. Lieutenant, you're an Eagle Scout, aren't you?
I am.
Tell us a little bit about your scouting experience and where you grew up and did your scouting.
So my situation was a little unusual. I'm a military brat, so I grew up with parents in the military, so moving around since I was small. So my Boy Scout career kind of scattered throughout the country and overseas. Made Eagle Scout in 1999 over in Germany, and kind of fell off the Boy Scout train after that, but was able to make Eagle Scouts, and hopefully I'll be able to get back into Boy Scouts soon as my young ones are getting old enough to join. So
that's great. So you're in the Coast Guard. What attracted you to the Coast Guard, and how did you get into your career?
Honestly, I didn't know anything about the Coast Guard until after I joined it. When I joined, I was living in Spokane, Washington State. I knew I was going to go into the service, into one service or another. I applied for the Coast Guard, and I also applied for the Air Force. And just so happens that Coast Guard called me first and offered me a spot in their officer candidate school. So I joined straight off the street, went to what the Coast Guard calls officer candidate school versus going to their academy. So I had a bachelor's degree before going into the Coast Guard.
As opposed where is the officers candidate school?
So the Coast Guard officer candidate school and their academy is in the same spot. It's in New London, Connecticut.
Very good. So where else has the Coast Guard brought you? And where are you stationed now? Where have you been and where are you now?
So I'm currently stationed in Washington, D.C. at Coast Guard headquarters. My Coast Guard career so far has taken me through Florida, Louisiana, Maryland, and Connecticut.
Yeah, you were right here at Sector Long Island Sound in New Haven, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, that's when we met. Excellent. So what is it you do with the Coast Guard? What's your job?
So my Coast Guard career kind of is generally all been in prevention, what we call prevention. And there's also a response side, which I have done as well. So the difference is prevention deals a lot more with regulatory compliance and standards, and the response department basically is the law enforcement, pollution cleanup, and also the enforcement, after you do something wrong, basically, or responding to search and rescue and things like that. Mm-hmm. The prevention side is more inspections, investigations, running applications for, like if you want to have an event on the waterway or something like that, that's going to impact commercial traffic, or have big fireworks display. All that comes through the Coast Guard. Large fishing tournaments, races, sailing events, all that comes through the prevention offices at various sectors, at various units. When I was in New Haven, my job was the chief of inspections, which was basically inspecting all commercial vessels. So anything from fishing charters to the large freighters that you see on the waterway. All Coast Guardsmen are responsible to maintain responder status. So that's where our responder activities come from. So if there's a hurricane, big pollution spill, any sort of event that requires first responders, the Coast Guard is trained to manage and respond to those events. So even though there are various career fields in the Coast Guard, the one common field that everybody kind of does is that whole response portion of it.
Yeah. So in my experience with the Coast Guard, and I've had the opportunity to interact with a few folks in my years. The Coast Guard has a lot more or greater public interaction than other branches of the service. And so you talked a little bit about how every Coast Guardsman is a first responder. But how else does the Coast Guard interact with the public, and how else does the Coast Guard help the American people? And likewise, how do you in your job?
Okay. Like I said before, the Coast Guard has various missions. Um, Part of those, a big part of those missions is safety on the water, and safety in general. So you we interact with the public anywhere from showing kids and people how to put on their life jackets to inspecting their vessels. We also have an auxiliary program, which is a volunteer program that we train people to do safety checks on recreational boating. But the other piece, you'll see the Coast Guard a lot. Like if you've ever taken a cruise, all cruise ships are escorted by Coast Guard small boats in and out of when they come into port. Um, you see Coast Guardsmen inspecting various vessels that like a ferry. So in Long Island, in Connecticut and Long Island, you have ferries that go back and forth between the two over in Bridgeport and in New London. So all those ferries that go back and forth are inspected by the Coast Guard. And if you ever wonder, how many passengers or how many, life jackets is this vessel supposed to have, you can always go somewhere. You can towards the bridge and ask them to see their certificate of inspection. It should be posted and it's viewable by the public. So if you ever wonder if this vessel has been inspected or has been looked at by the Coast Guard, you can just always look for that certificate. Um,
So we live in some interesting times right now with the pandemic and our local and nationwide response to COVID-19. How has your job changed, and how has what the Coast Guard does both in the last changed in the last 5 months?
my current job more deals more with policy and regulation. Basically, we are either writing regulations, writing policy to help out field units do their job. So my job in particular hasn't really been affected too much, except for the fact that I do it at home versus doing it in the office. We hold all our meetings through a web service, a secure web service, and we use email and phone calls basically to conduct our business right now at this level. Field units, it's impacting them a lot more. They're having to do a lot more risk management for inspections and doing a lot more what they can virtually from the office. If there's an administrative inspection that they have to do, which is basically inspecting a vessel's logs, certificates, um, papers that they're required to have, a lot of that stuff can be done from the office. The actual inspection is basically done on risk-based system. If vessels are known to not be in compliance or just troubled cases, the Coast Guard is still going to go out and do that mission. For vessels that every time the Coast Guard goes out and they have no issues and have always gotten a perfect inspection, then risk management base says, okay, that vessel can probably skip this quarterly or this annual inspection. You still do parts of it, you just kind of do more of a spot check versus a full-blown inspection, then you catch it on the next time around.
How does what you do relate to the values of scouting that you learned in the Scout Oath and the Scout Law? And has scouting helped you? What you learned in scouting helped you and prepared you for your life and for your role in the Coast Guard?
So be prepared. That is so the Coast Guard's motto is Semper Paratus, which is always ready. So you can kind of see how that correlates to be prepared. It's the same thing, just said in different words. As a Coast Guardsman, you're always required to be able to pick up and go as short notice. to go to respond to anything or even deploy to hazardous situations. Always have to make sure you have everything you need to go and be ready at a moment's notice. Scouting, the way scouting has prepared me in life, in any military service, the scouting is pretty structured. You have your different ranks in scouting. You have tenderfoot, first class, star, life, all up to eagle, which kind of mimic in a little sense the ranks of the military. It's just not as prescriptive. You're not going to be taking orders from your fellow Boy Scouts, but you do listen to what they have to say because they're the ones that have the more experience. So the newer you are at scouting, the more you're going to rely on those members that have, you're going to listen more to a life scout than you are to a tenderfoot, just purely based off experience. Same goes with the military. You're gonna rely on those people that have the most experience to teach you and guide you throughout your career. It kind of sets you up for that structurized way of thinking. Merit badges. You think you're only going to get merit badges in the Boy Scouts? Well, any military service, especially the Coast Guard, we have things called qualifications. Qualification is basically a glorified merit badge. You run through a book that has all these tasks and all these things that you have to do, all this knowledge you're required to have. And at the end, you demonstrate that you're able to do, you take a test, and voila, you have a merit badge, which is a qualification. And it's just more things that you can do in your career, more knowledge or more things that you can do throughout your career. For example, the Coast Guard on the response side has various types of boats. Well, you have to be qualified to operate various types of boats. So you can think of those qualifications as a merit badge for each of those boats. On the prevention side, for us, we have various types and sizes of vessels that we inspect or investigate, or facilities. So maritime facilities, anything that receives oil or chemicals, grains, any of that stuff, cars, containers that come from foreign vessels, or just the commodities themselves, all those facilities are inspected by the Coast Guard. Those are just more merit badges, basically, that you're getting while you're in the Coast Guard. So scouting, believe it or not, scouting prepares you for the military for the most part. It's just not as structurized as the military. It teaches you discipline. It teaches you, how to follow directions. So I in my opinion, I think scouting prepared me for the military life in general.
So you mentioned merit badges. What were your favorite merit badges when you were a scout? Were they small boat sailing, rowing, maybe life saving, preparing you for the Coast Guard?
Actually, some of my favorite ones were some of the shooting sports. Archery, the rifle, basically anything active. Swimming was one of my favorite merit badges. Mm-hmm. Some of the merit badges have changed since I've been in, but
yeah, since you and I were scouts, we now have one that would correlate pretty well with the Coast Guard, being search and rescue. Didn't have that when we were scouts, but yeah, that's a newer addition.
Yeah, I want to say there's one in emergency preparedness too, if I don't.
There is.
So that's another one that would correlate pretty well for the Coast Guard. Mm-hmm. So anything swimming wise, although that's a misnomer, just because people are in the Navy or in the Coast Guard doesn't mean they know how to swim.
Don't fall overboard.
Don't fall overboard.
Yeah.
I happen to be a pretty good swimmer.
So did you do your swimming merit badge and some of those other merit badges at scout camp? Where did you go to scout camp?
So I went to various camps. A lot of my favorite ones were some in Idaho, Diamond Lake up in Idaho, and then we went to a large one, which I can't really recall the name of it. There is a big one in Germany. I just can't recall the name of it, but German scouting is fun. When you're overseas, you're still part of BSA, but when you go to these camporees and jamborees and things like that, you kind of interact with the German version of scouting. So it's interesting seeing scouts from other countries, basically doing the same thing you're doing.
Mm. So I was at the World Scout Jamboree last year when it was hosted here in the United States at the summit in West Virginia. And I got to meet quite a number of German scouts and learned that they camp a little differently than we do. So you probably know what I'm talking about. Well, we've got our smaller tents. They camp out in these giant black tent structures. You know what I'm talking about?
Uh, when I went there, it was they had some canvas tents and stuff like that, but
Hmm.
for us, there were smaller troops, so it was everybody was pretty much the same.
Hmm. Okay. All right.
Um, some of the camps that we had, a lot of the adults got their big canvas tents that they can sleep in, and we kind of were left to our own devices. So whatever you bring.
So, Lieutenant, some of our scouts might be interested in potential careers in the United States Coast Guard. Could you talk a little bit about different paths that they might take and some of the benefits they might have if either enlisting or perhaps wanting to go the route you did through Officer Candidate School or to the United States Coast Guard Academy?
Um, okay, I'll answer them separately. So if you want to enlist in the Coast Guard, um, being an Eagle Scout is definitely a bonus. You basically come in as a one rank higher than you would if you were off the street not being an Eagle Scout. So that's a little bit different in pay when you after boot camp you come out and you're already one step ahead. If you go the route I did, which is go to college, have a degree, and apply for Officer Candidate School, um, it's really hard to show leadership the kind of leadership that the military services want. Being in college or you have to have something. Boy Scouts basically is one big leadership trip. I mean, as an Eagle Scout, going all throughout the Boy Scouts, you're being a leader every step of the way. So those skills that you learn and the stories you can tell go really far into showing that you are capable of being a leader in whatever service that you're going to join. So it's going to look very favorable in your interviews that you do when you want to join. They'll interview you and they'll rate you, and leadership is one of those elements that's really hard for anybody coming off the street to demonstrate that they've done. Being in the Boy Scouts, that gives you one level above your average person. If you want to go to the academy, the Coast Guard Academy is one of the harder academies to get into, just because it does require it's very competitive. There's fewer spots in the academy, and you're required to get a letter from your senator to join. So out of the 3 service academies, the Coast Guard Academy is one of the harder ones to get into. If you're going to enlist, you want to go to a recruiter, and they'll tell you all the information, all the steps that you need to take to join.
All right. Okay, Omar, anything else that you want to add, or anything that we didn't talk about you think would be of interest to the scouts?
Yeah, I'll put in the plug that if if the scouts are interested, they can contact the unit that's closer to them. There's usually, when I was in New Haven, there was at least 3 Eagle Scouts at that unit, so any one of them can possibly talk to the command to coordinate a visit, a tour, maybe even a ride on some of the small boats. Probably not right now, but when the whole COVID issue blows over, we did it all the time.
Yeah. And then I guess the local commands in our council would be all based out of New Haven, correct? So you've got Sector Long Island Sound there. You've got the Bollard, I believe, which is a small cutter, Station New Haven, and a couple of others located right there as well, aren't there?
Yeah, so right there in New Haven, or right there on Woodward Drive, there's a couple commands there. There's the bollard, like you mentioned, and it's a aids to navigation tender.
Hmm.
So it's an ATON cutter. So you'll notice that with Coast Guard, there's three types of colors on the boats. There's the white hulls. Those are essentially all your law enforcement and longer distance cutters. You have your black hulls, like the bollard, which are all construction and buoy tenders and all that stuff. And then you have your red hulls, which are like your ice breakers. So those are the really big boys.
Hmm.
At Sector Long Island Sound, you have aids to navigation team, which has smaller vessels that they go out and service aids to navigation, which are your day boards, your buoys, some of your lighthouses. You have your small boat station, which basically handles all the search and rescue and law enforcement in Long Island Sound. That and also Station New London. I believe Eaton's Neck covers the lower half of Sound Up. So in Montauk. So those are the commands that are easily accessible from Connecticut. Is anything in Long Island Sound, in New Haven, and one in New London. So
Yes, we've had some great cooperation from the Coast Guard with scouting nationally and locally here. Especially with our Sea Scout program. When I was active as skipper of a Sea Scout ship in New Haven, we actually met on the mess deck at Sector Long Island Sound on a weekly basis, and we arranged for tours of the sector and did a lot with the folks over at Station New Haven, and actually got to go out on the bollard. So lots of great opportunity there, and so scouts and scout leaders, don't be shy about asking the Coast Guard for a little help or to go check some cool things out.
exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Lieutenant Torre, United States Coast Guard, thank you very much for joining us today and speaking with our scouts about what you do, about the Coast Guard, and why it's so important to us as citizens, and for sharing some of your scouting experiences as well. Thanks very much.
No problem. Just one last note to all the scouts: just have fun in scouting. Take all the opportunities you can, and just remember that everything you do in the Coast Guard or in the Boy Scouts can relate to, pretty much any profession you go towards. So